At this point, I would like to acknowledge the parallel and overlapping contributions of other publications on the study of wisdom, although they have not been used directly here, as, for my sins, I've only recently come across them. First, there is an appendix in Stephen Covey's book, First Things First, which is called The Wisdom Literature. This explores the patterns, consistencies, and themes that the authors consider represent the most validated database in all human experience. Second, there is a book, The Wisdom of the Ages, Eternal Truths for Everyday Life, which I find to be a remarkable analysis of how we can live more meaningful lives by close study of the words of poets and philosophers throughout the ages. And finally, the book, Working Wisdom, The Ultimate Value in the New Economy, by John Della Costa. This publication is not, for some reason, easy to obtain, and it strongly argues that our perceived wisdom is the driving force behind our behavior, and that the subject is a vital part of any effective knowledge management program. Yet in a quick survey of 18 books on knowledge management, I found that only 3 felt the subject of wisdom was sufficiently important to mention in the index. And apart from those mentioned earlier, none of these appeared to give the subject the importance that I believe it justifies. To return now to my core theme, as we move into the next millennium, the knowledge economy is being given more and more attention. As a result, we are, and need to be, increasingly concerned with what core knowledge, that is, knowledge that has been distilled through the experience of history into wisdom, is critically important for us to preserve and pass on to future generations. There are grounds for optimism. The important messages appear to be relatively simple. To quote a Swedish statesman who lived during the 17th century, "Dost thou know, my son, with how little wisdom the world is governed? How much better the world would be if we could make just a small improvement." But that could also support the case for pessimism, as history appears to show that it is incredibly easy to ignore the learning of the experiences of earlier millennia. To use another quote, if we still have not learnt the lessons of 2,000 years or more of history, why should we suddenly start being able to learn it now? Or to put that point another way, the only lesson we can learn from history is that we don't learn the lessons of history. Perhaps that quotation is right, but surely the case for making an effort is overwhelming. At least we must believe that things are likely to be much worse if we didn't even try. In attempting to produce a distillation of the wisdom of the world, reflected by the sayings of those who have considered these issues, both practically and philosophically, over the past millennia, it is clear that despite the enormous changes and an enormous increase in what has been written in the last 2,000 or 3,000 years, we, as individuals or as society, appear to be little the wiser. Why has not all this increased effort and experience been translated into wisdom, effective learning, and wiser actions? Many, perhaps even all, the important messages about the state and future of the human race were made over 1,000 years ago in China, the Middle East, and other parts of the world, where early sophisticated societies had developed. This should not surprise us, as wisdom consists of insights that have stood the test of time, precisely because they are concerned with making statements about relationships between people, either individually or in a societal context, or about our relationship with the universe as a whole. And it should not surprise us that many of the comments quoted have religious roots. Perhaps I should mention at this point that there is no overt religious agenda in my approach. I come to those issues as a positive agnostic to organized religion. That is, I don't know the answers, but I like to think I'm interested in exploring what the answers are or might be. And my prime concern is what might help organizations or society as a whole work better over the longer term. It is an interesting aside and possibly a sad reflection on the state of the 20th century to ask and to try to answer the question, what additional wisdom insights have been contributed this century that were not essentially the result of recycling earlier ideas? Have we really made progress in this area? That is a matter of considerable debate. To start, we need to agree on how we measure progress. One thing I am sure of is that GDP and other economically driven forms of measurement are not only very misleading, but they can also be potentially very damaging in the long run. To come back to the wisdom messages themselves, I've collected together an initial list of well over 1,000 quotations on the topic. These are currently available on the website of the World Future Society in the section Messages for the New Millennium, and their website address is www.wfs.org. These quotations are listed for discussion and debate. They do not pretend to be definitive, and a mechanism exists on that website for further additions to the list. Further suggestions have been provided, and more are most welcome. Now I would like to share with you a few wisdom statements which I have found relevant to my life and career. For example, Martin Fisher, a 20th century American psychologist, said, "Knowledge is a process of piling up facts. Wisdom lies in their simplification." Henry Frederick Amiel, a 19th century Swiss writer, linked wisdom to age as follows: "To know how to grow old is the masterwork of wisdom, and one of the most difficult chapters in the great art of living." So what are some of the general wisdom messages that we might like to pass on to future generations? Here is a brief selection, starting with a quote by Edward Abbey, a 20th century author, who said, "Growth for the sake of growth is the ideology of the cancer cell." One of the 12th century French philosophers, Peter Abelard, had a famous quotation that read, "By doubting we come to examine, and by examining so we perceive the truth." Yet our quest for wisdom or the truth does not necessarily lead to action, as noted by the American psychiatrist Alfred Adler, who said, "It is easier to fight for one's principles than to live up to them." The Bazato people in Africa, however, expressed their belief in the need for reflection before action as follows: "If a person does away with their traditional way of living and throws away their good customs they had better first make certain they have something of value to replace them. Henry Ward Beecher, a 19th century congregational minister and author, found value in using strength not only in being strong, as illustrated in this quote. Greatness lies not in being strong, but in the right use of strength. Judson Branch, the chairman of Allstate, a U.S. insurance company, reminded us that we should focus on producing rather than on being recognized for our efforts when he said, "There is no limit to what the good person can do if they don't care who gets the credit." This is an interesting observation, don't you think? Now let me offer you a few future-related words of wisdom. An old Arab proverb illustrates the importance of letting values lead us through life by engaging in what one has a passion for. It goes like this: throw your heart out in front of you and run ahead to catch it. The 18th century British author Samuel Johnson also emphasized thinking about the future with his quote, "The future is purchased by the present." A similar point was made, using different words, by Clement Attlee, a former Prime Minister of Britain, in his quote, "The greatest challenge for democracy is to persuade people not to eat the seed corn of tomorrow's harvest." Another famous English 20th century statesman, Sir Winston Churchill, is quoted as having said, "The further back you look, the further forward you see." Observing how we can improve over time, Rabbi Naaman of Bratislav noted, "If you won't be better tomorrow than you were today, then what do you need tomorrow for?" Seneca, the first century Roman statesman, promoted long-term planning as the world remembers him by these words: "Enjoy present pleasures in such a way as not to injure future ones." In realizing our goals for the future, Mahatma Gandhi emphasized the value of leading by example, as illustrated by this quote: "You must be the change you want to see in the world." To craft a vision for the future, Malcolm X, a leading Afro-American human rights activist in the 1960s, preached the importance of learning, as illustrated in the following quote: "Education is your passport to the future, for tomorrow belongs to the people who prepare for it today." Another perspective on teaching was expressed by US teacher and astronaut Krista McAuliffe when she said, "I touch the future, I teach." As we move towards a conclusion, I would just like to emphasize the point that wisdom is related to the way we use knowledge. The wise decision inevitably includes value judgments, beliefs and feelings and thoughts. It invariably involves moral choices. Hence it is not surprising that we find that the comments we might define as wisdom are essentially comments about the relationship between people or their relationship with society and the universe. It should not surprise us that these are relatively timeless statements. But what certainly surprised me when I started looking at this subject was the paradoxical gap between how critically important this area was in all our lives, and yet how often it seemed to be almost totally ignored in futurist, strategy, or knowledge management literature. Another paradox is that we appear to be spending more and more time focusing on learning knowledge that has a short shelf life and less on knowledge that overlaps with wisdom and has a long shelf life. Why is that? What can we do about it? Do you agree with this trend? In recent years, we have seen efforts to move people from the idea of working harder to the idea of working smarter. Increasingly, we need to move beyond working smarter to working wiser. As we move along that progression, we are moving from a preoccupation with work as a primarily physical activity to a situation where the important issues primarily reflect the quality of our values rather than the quantity of our physical effort. Perhaps you cannot teach wisdom, but it is certainly most unlikely that it is in our genes. So somehow it must be learnt. The question is how. How can we make that learning process more effective? On the assumption, of course, that we consider that is an important thing to do. Let me summarize my remarks by modifying the comments of the 20th century poet T.S. Eliot. Where is the wisdom we have lost in chaos and complexity? Where is the knowledge we have corrupted in knowledge's power? Where is the information we have lost in information overload? Where is the data we have lost in answering the wrong questions? If we want to manage complexity successfully and make progress in the world today, we have to start by getting the simple things right. This needs to be based on more effective understanding and use of accumulated wisdom. Unfortunately, all too often problems arise precisely because we haven't got the simple things right in the first place. This includes the need for a greater emphasis on sharing knowledge rather than the more traditional concept of knowledge is power. And we need to be reasonably sure we are starting by asking the right questions. Only then will we have any chance of avoiding the chaos and stress of massive and meaningless change that is all too often associated with information overload. But probably the most important of these simple things to get right is for leaders to walk the talk. It is relatively easy to know what is the right thing to do. The hard thing is to ensure that it gets done, as we can remember from the quote from Gandhi, which I cited earlier. Perhaps one question I can leave with you is, why does it appear to be relatively easy to recognize wisdom, but so incredibly difficult and rare to be wise in practice? Finally, I come back to the point I made at the beginning of my presentation. Why are we interested in the future? The answer, I believe, is that we are concerned about trying to make things better for us all, for everyone, in the future. So we come back to re-asking why we do not spend more time on ensuring that we have learned the lessons from the past, N,000 years, defined here as wisdom, that would be useful for us to pass on to future generations. And how do we ensure these messages are learnt more effectively? I hope I've not given the impression that I know what this elusive concept we call wisdom actually is, or how we can pass it on more effectively. All I'm arguing is that we urgently need to give these questions much more serious attention than has been the case in the past. And there is no better opportunity to do this than at the start of a new millennium. If we cannot take wisdom seriously now, we never will, and we will pay a very high price for this neglect. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lloyd. Let us begin the first question and answer session. We will try to answer as many questions as possible. Therefore, we ask that only one question be asked per phone call, and that these questions be as brief as possible. You may call the studio directly at the phone numbers or fax which appear on your screen. We remind you to make your phone calls at a distance from the monitor to avoid feedback. Our first call is from Mexico. It is from La Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, Facultad de Estudios Superiores in Cuautitlán, in the city of Cuautitlán, in the state of Mexico.
Good morning. Greetings from the Universidad Nacional Autónoma of Mexico. We know that time is gold, and we have many questions, and we would like to participate. Among the different theories of knowledge and wisdom, there's the theory of knowing from inside towards the outside, because we know that there's the wisdom inside ourselves and outside what surrounds us. Now, we know that knowing our past, the question is, will that allow us to be better strategists? The other question is, there's a difference between knowledge and wisdom. Now, there is a controversy, and we believe that it's an educational process that allows for productivity based on a new paradigm. Would you consider that the correct approach would be to look for wisdom from an epistemological approach? Is that how we should look for wisdom?
Dr. Lloyd, let's take the second question first, knowledge and wisdom.
I think that the big difference between knowledge and wisdom, without going into a lot of discussion about detailed definitions, is that knowledge very rarely has values incorporated in it. Wisdom incorporates values as a part of the statement. And so that is the overriding way in which you can test whether or not it's knowledge or whether it's wisdom. But of course, not all value statements are wise or wisdom.
How about helping with strategy? Will wisdom make us a better strategist in a business context or educational?
Well, the strategy is really about trying to establish what is really important in terms of helping an organization operate more effectively. And quite often you find that the key points in getting strategy right are missing because people are not getting the basic issues right. Like in many organizations, there is a culture still of knowledge is power rather than sharing knowledge. And if you have that culture, it's very unlikely that you will get most management techniques to work effectively. And certainly, learning is not going to be very effective in a culture where knowledge is power.
Our next question is also from Mexico. It's from La Universidad La Salle in El Distrito Federal, Mexico City, Mexico.
Morning. On behalf of the La Salle University, we congratulate all the members of the network and the participants and the speakers of today because of this excellent subject. My name is Benjamin Castañeda, and I would like to talk a little more about what are the principles that allow us to distinguish when a known statement should be also considered, when a famous quote should be also considered a wise quote. Thank you.
Dr. Lloyd?
Well, one of the ways in which you can do this is to ask a large number of people whether they agree with it. It's a very simple test, but it's a very effective one. And one of the things to bear in mind there is that most of these statements, if not all of them, are not culturally dependent. You will find that they apply round the world in almost every culture. And so that would be the first test that I would make.
Dr. Goldstein.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think there is something, you know, it's funny because the word that first came to my mind when this discussion began was spirituality. You know, there is a certain, I don't know, an intuitive ring to these things. And as I listened to Dr. Lloyd's presentation, with each of those wise statements, you know, the first part sets it up, and then you say, of course, yes, that's true. There's that kind of response, and you immediately feel that there's something more than just the words, namely more than just, you know, the aggregate of the words. But I would use the word spirituality. It's almost as though people have a kind of experience at a different plane.
Thank you. Our next call is from Brazil. It is from the Serviço Nacional de Aprendizagem Comercial in the city of Porto Alegre in the state of Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil. Okay, we'll take another call while we try to reestablish communication with Brazil. This one will be from Panama. It'll be from La Universidad Tecnológica de Panamá in Panama City, Panama. Our next call, we're having some technical difficulties with those two calls. We'll try to find them. Let's now talk again to Mexico, to the Dirección General de Educación Tecnológica Industrial, CETIS número 3, number 3, in Mexico City, Mexico.
Good morning. As to wise statement, what counts is not what we say, but what we do. My question is, why developed countries do not support those organizations that request educational support in other countries, given that there are always political issues involved and conditions?
Dr. Lloyd, support for education in other countries.
Well, that's a very big question, because I think at all levels you can see, and you're using a very good example, that there is little point in people saying things if they don't match what they say with what they do. And in the end, people take a lot more notice of what they do rather than what they say. And unfortunately, that applies to bringing up young children, it applies to leaders in organizations, and it applies to international political relationships. And it would be a very useful thing for people at all those levels to recognize that other people are much more influenced by what people do, reflecting what they say, but they take very little notice of what they say if that's not reflected in what they do.
Our next call is from Mexico. It is from La Universidad Autónoma de Chihuahua in the state of Chihuahua, the city of Chihuahua in Mexico.
Good morning. The last statement from the speaker was that the productive value of wisdom does not go with the epistemological principle of knowledge that trends to emancipation and the growth of a being. Is that what you meant? But
Dr. Lloyd, did you hear the question?
Yes, I'm not sure that I understood it fully, but I'll try to answer it as best I can. Certainly, I think that there is an important integration of knowledge with wisdom. There is a very substantial extent that you wouldn't have wisdom if it wasn't based on distilled knowledge. It's a higher form of knowledge, and so there is an integrated way of looking at the relationship between knowledge and wisdom.